Okay, um, so we're going to talk about APIs. Is that a new concept for you?
I've heard about it, working with some websites, but I'm not too sure about it. I don't have a clear picture.
That's exactly how I was when I started teaching this course a couple of years ago. Like I knew in concept what an API was, but if you asked me to actually explain it, I'd do it. So I spent a lot of time trying to learn that just to sort of sort it out, because it turns out that it's not actually all that complicated. Okay, the first thing is, what does it stand for? It's Application Program Interface. And notice how I have some extra space there between the word program and interface. Right? That's because the way that we want to hear this is an interface for an application program. And by application program, we just mean something that somebody uses. So it's just a application and kind of redundant here. So it's the interface that a program uses in contrast to an interface that a user uses. So when you take out your phone and you look at it, you're looking at the user interface. But when you're writing code and you're accessing, say, Facebook or YouTube to get something from them, then you're using a program interface. So the way we might look at that is like this. So think of the service out there in the cloud somewhere as a black box. And I'm going to write some code, and somewhere in that code is going to be a thing that goes and accesses that black box. So the lab that we're going to do in conjunction with this session is the black box is going to be the New York Times. And the New York Times has a service on the internet from which you can get a copy of any article that has ever appeared in the New York Times throughout the last 150 years. We don't want to get down and dirty with service. All we want to know is how do we talk to the New York Times to say, I would like an article from 1961 that is about hot air ballooning, or I want an article about clowns from the 1970s, or I know when was the first review for The Lion King. So I want to know, how is it that the New York Times would like me to ask that question? And then when it has an answer for me, what form is it going to give me that answer in? And so the idea of the interface is the two sides. How do I ask the question? And how is the answer going to come back to me? Now, it turns out that there are APIs like all over the place. The world is just full of them. So, for example, this is an API, right? We might also say it's just a menu at a restaurant. But if you think about it, what is behind the scenes at a restaurant? And if I'm sitting out there and I want to order my lunch, I really don't want to deal with all of this. What I want to deal with is something nice and simple like this. And they've kind of laid it out, and they said, you want to eat lunch here? Here's how you do it. You need to pick a green. Well, first you have to pick whether you want a chopped salad or a flipped salad. And then you say whether you want a large one or a small one. And then you pick your greens. You pick an ingredient. You pick these extra items on it. You can pick some sprinkles to put on top. And then finally you pick a drink. And you can specify whether it's on the side or mixed in. So if you've ever been a waiter, what you've essentially been is a part of the API for the kitchen in the restaurant. Here's another one that some of us are probably familiar with, a thing called Service Ontario. Service Ontario is in a sense an API for all the services that Ontario offers to the residents of the province. Now, what's behind the scenes is stuff like this: crazy organizational charts, people who work here, people who work there, people who are printing driver's licenses and license plates, and fishing licenses and bait finding licenses and so on. And that would be kind of crazy to have to deal with that. So instead, you just go down to Service Ontario and you take a number, and then you walk up to a desk and say, I'd like to get a new sticker for my license plate of my car, or I'd like to register my new baby and get it, and so on. So that's another one that's out there. And then here's a third one. Recognize this as the kind of plug that they use in Europe. So a plug on a device, on an appliance, and the plug on the wall of your house, that's an API as well. And what is it an API for? A whole electric system is out there, and it provides the service. And that electricity that is provided might come from a generator on a river out in Niagara Falls. It could come from a nuclear power station. It could come from solar. And when you plug something into the wall, you don't care where that electricity came from, right? But I found it funny here in Toronto, when we talk about the electric company, we call it hydro. But of course, hydro means water. So why would it be that you put a plug in the wall, connect to hydro? Well, the answer is that at some point, most of the electricity was created by falling water, by transformers on water. And so we called the electrical system the hydro system. So over right in red, you can think of all those things as applications or devices. And in between is where we have the API. So the general idea is the API is something that allows you in a very simple way to make a connection to something which behind the scenes might be very powerful and very complex. And if you think about the pictures on the right here, we've got a coffee maker and a microwave, a television and a hair dryer and a toaster and a washing machine and an oven and a vacuum cleaner, right? The beauty of the hydro system is as long as these devices has the right plug on it, you can just stick it in the wall, you'll get electricity, and the thing will run. Okay? If you took your dryer over to Europe, you'd actually have to use a different API. You'd have to get a different plug in order to connect to the system. But once you did that, your dryer would work the same. So an API has that kind of quality where as long as you get the connection correct, you can hook things on either side. And the service doesn't care what devices are connected to it, because all the service sees is a request for electricity. And similarly, the devices don't care what source of the electricity is, what the source of the electricity is. If it's coming from solar power, if it's coming from a battery, if it's coming from hydro, if it's coming from nuclear, we're indifferent to that. Okay, so that's lesson one, sort of basic, what is an API functionally. Point number two is going to be that APIs come in different flavors or styles, where there's sort of different protocols for APIs. Okay. And the two you'll hear most frequently are SOAP and REST. SOAP, which is Simple Object Access Protocol, and REST, which is the one that we'll see more often. The SOAP is a little older and it uses XML, which is an extensible markup language. You'll see it out there, don't need to worry about it. And the stuff that we're learning about today is all going to be on the REST side. So here's a picture of what it looks like when we're making use of an API. So down in the lower right, you have your application. And so here's some code that we've written in our application. You see the first thing up here is a variable called URL, and then that's equal to a string, which looks like a regular URL, https://fakenews.ai.com/stories. So up till there, that's something we see all the time. But then we have question mark, limit equals 5. So what we're going to say is that the URLs that we use with an API have some parameters tacked on to the back end. And the question mark is what indicates that that's what's happening now. So it's the URL like normal, and then a question mark, and then some parameters. And the code takes that and sets it up to the API. The API kind of crunches on it, and then it sends us back a response in JSON. So JSON, which we saw in our data jigs chapter. So the request is in the form of a URI, which is essentially URL with some extra information in it. And then the response is going to come back, and it's going to look like this on the side with JSON. And we'll see a little while later that the basic way that this happens in code is you have a function, and there's different versions of this, but you can have a function built in called load JSON. You give it the URL, and then you give the name of what we call a callback function. And the callback function is going to be another function in your code, and load JSON is going to basically sit there and make the request, and then it just says, I will sit around and wait. When the JSON file comes in, what I'm going to do is at that point, I will start the callback function, and I'll hand it the JSON file, and the callback function will name the JSON file data. So it's just call it data, and then inside of that callback file is where stuff happens. So we'll see this a couple of times as we go through today. Okay, before we go on, we just want to take a closer look at those parameters in the URL. So again, starts out with HTTPS as normal and a colon double backslash, and then the domain name of the server that we're talking to, question mark, and then parameter equals value. Parameter equals value, and you can have as many of these as you like, and they're going to be separated by this ampersand, this and symbol. So question mark and parameter equals value, ampersand, parameter equals value. So we think of these as key equals value pairs. And you may remember that that's exactly the same structure we saw inside of JSON. So this is more expansion of that. So over on the left, we have what's going on at the browser level. So in the application I'm running in my browser, right, I've got this long string that I'm sending to the API. So the part in red is finding the server. The part in green is finding its way down the directory structure of the server. The pink part here is starting up some service or some action or some program that's running on the server. And then the blue part are the parameters that I'm sending to that function. That function is going to then run and process the values that I sent it, produce some output in JSON, and send that back to me. And my callback function will be sitting there with open arms waiting for it. Questions so far? Okay, so 4 points about that. The text after the question mark is the data that's going to the API. That data parameters are always expressed as key equals value pairs. We separate them with an ampersand. And then this one last little thing, special characters, and by special characters we mean things like spaces and quotation marks and colons and things like that. Things that would look like the end of a word. So if you think back to what we learned in regex, there are certain symbols that had to escape because regex looked at those symbols and it sort of took them as part of its own language. We said, oh no, in this case, I actually just want to talk about a period as in the character period, not something that is a part of regex. So what I did is I put a backslash in front of those. So in a similar sort of thing, we have to encode characters when we're putting them in a URL. And there's 4 of these things that you need to pay attention to or you need to be aware of. So we have here ASCII table. And the 4 things are going to be space, the ampersand, the plus sign, and the comma. And then there's the colon as well, and the quotes. So there's actually 6 of them. I misspoke. So the hex code for a space is 20. So it's the decimal number 32, hexamal 20. When we write that in a URL, we're going to write it as %20. Okay? If I have an ampersand and I don't mean it to be separating 2 key value pairs, but if instead I'm saying, no, I'm talking about the ampersand, the character, then I would encode that with %26. And then a plus sign and comma and so on. So the main one that you really need to pay attention to here is %20. You'll see that a lot. So here, for example, suppose up top, what I wanted to do was I wanted to say to a API, I wanted to say, listen, can you find me a title of an article called Letter by Letter? So I'm looking for a newspaper article called Letter by Letter, and the fields that I want you to send me, I want the byline, I want to know who wrote this article, I want the date that it was published, I want its full title, and I want the URL so I can link to it. That's what I want to say to my API. And so I'm going to now kind of see what that would look like in the URL. So query equals title colon quote. We're going to see that as query equals title %3a %22 and then letter. And this is something you'll very commonly see, a plus sign using standing for the spaces in text. If I just left that as a space, then the thing which is interpreted in the URL, oh, I've reached the end of the URL. So put a plus sign there, and it knows to interpret that as a space. And the reason we needed on the previous slide, the reason we need to know the encoding for a plus sign, because if we actually mean the plus sign and we don't just mean, oh, this stands for a space, then I would put %2b in there. And then finally, the quotes at the end. And then if I'm writing fields equal byline, comma, space, date, and I'm just going to do the same thing here, except now I'm going to have my commas replaced by %2c. Okay. Don't sweat the details of this. Unless you spend an incredible amount of time programming these kinds of things, you're not going to keep these equivalences in your head. What you want to remember is that this is a thing that we do, right? That when it comes to URLs, there are certain characters that are going to need to be coded, and if you have to look them up each time, that's not a big deal. Okay, let's do a little exercise. So write down a URL that would let us order from Emma's Diner, and you can just make up the domain name. Maybe it's Emma's Restaurant or emmasdiner.ca. So suppose you wanted to order some lunch and you wanted to order it through the API. So write out a URL that's going to be https:// emmasrestaurant.ca/orders ? What? So we can try some of these in chat. Anybody still out there? Or am I all by myself now? So we got some to say. It could be flipped plus salads. Um, if we need to write that whole thing down. And what if you wanted to also say that you wanted buffalo chicken with that? Had So salad equals flipped plus salads. That's the first part. That's checking something at the top there. Um, and suppose we wanted main equals exactly. So main equals buffalo chicken. Now I assume the question mark at the end is you raising your voice as opposed to saying that question mark would be in there, right? Okay, great. If we wanted to put them together, what's that going to look like? Look great, exactly. Yep. Okay. So let's jump on here. Right, so I've just sort of thrown a version in here and so on. So the main thing is it's always going to be a key or a variable name equals a value, ampersand, a variable name equals a value, ampersand, etc., etc. Okay, so that was part number 2 about how we talk to an API. Now, part number 3 is a very quick introduction to conceptual aspects of APIs. So by conceptually is that we are now intellectually we're abstracting quite far away from detail. How does the URL work, or is this a REST API or a SOAP API, and so on. I'm just to say that another general thing about the way APIs work is that they involve abstraction and encapsulation, and so these are two terms that you want a sense of and have them as a part of your intellectual vocabulary. Okay, so first, abstraction. So the plug on the wall is an abstraction of electrical system. Okay, it's an abstraction in the sense that if I said to you, so what is the electrical system in Ontario? And you'd say, well, there's a company called Toronto Hydro, and there's another one called Niagara Power, and so on. And these companies are licensed by the government, and they have power lines, and there are some nuclear stations, and there's some coal stations, and there are some hydroelectric dams, and then on each street there's electric wires that are carried on poles, and on and on and on. That's the electric generation and transmission system in the province of Ontario in Canada. Or you can just say it's hydro and there's a plug in the wall. And I'm using the European plug here mostly just to be provocative so that we can kind of jump a little bit out of our taken for granted. So it's an abstraction in the sense that the plug in the wall stands for all the system behind it. Okay, encapsulation. Okay, and we're giving a definition here because we've talked about abstraction before, but we haven't talked about encapsulation. So encapsulation, formally defined, it's a mechanism for restricting the direct access to or just hiding of a system's components. So we have a lot of encapsulation in our daily life, right? When and we caution our friends and we say, hey, TMI, too much information, right? What we're saying there is, I'd like to deal with you as a friend. I want to think of you as a fellow student and somebody who's in my program, and maybe we go out and have a drink on a Friday night, but I really don't need to know all those inner details. Right? I'm trying to encapsulate my experience of the other person. So here's an example of some encapsulation. I bet a lot of you have these things on the left, right? A thing that's going to power your MacBook. And if you were to take one of those things apart, what we see on the right is what's inside that. So it's an installation in the sense that that white brick, which has a cord coming out to a mag connector on the one side, and it's got two prongs coming out on the other side. Two prongs are an interface to the Hydro, right? So that's an accessing that API, right? But the encapsulated part here in the middle, right? All this stuff is really more than any of us want to know anything about. And you really, or Apple really doesn't want anybody who's trying to make a MacBook work. They don't want them fiddling around with this stuff, right? So there's probably a note on here. It's invisible to us, but there's a note on there that basically says nothing in here is useful to the consumer. Okay, so that's the sense we're saying. We're encapsulating it. And encapsulation with regard to APIs means we're going to do that with a whole bunch of code. We're gonna take a lot of the code that runs something like Facebook and say, general public, we really don't want your fingers on stuff. But we will expose our API to you, and we'll say that you can send a message to our API and say, who are Dan Ryan's friends? And the API will return the JSON that includes my list of friends. So the Facebook API will be happy to do that, but it really doesn't want anybody digging down there in the capacitors and the fuses and so on. Okay, the next slide is going to be a sort of an animation of how the conversation between an application program, its user, and a server's API. So let's take a look. So we got the user, and then they fire up an app, and the UI gets some information. We create an API request. We send that API request to the service. The blue flowchart there represents the superficial part of the decisioning that's going on inside the server. And behind the scenes, there's lots of other flowcharts because tons of other details that we don't want to know about. The red line here represents the encapsulation, right? All of that stuff is detail that we don't have access to, right? So we create the request, we wait for it, we send the request, it goes through, the result is generated, it's sent back, and then my application program is then going to figure out how to display that for the user. So if you're looking at Instagram, and Instagram lists all of the people that you follow on a single page. Okay, so that's the app starting, presenting some information to the user. And then you click on one of the people you follow. That's getting the information from the user, and then it's the API request, sends that off to Instagram. Instagram then grabs the pictures, puts them into a JSON file, sends them back to your app. Your app is then going to process that information and display those photos to you. After that, you might decide you want to like one of those photos. And so at that point, the same thing's going to happen. It's going to get the information from you. It's going to send something up to the server. And in that case, it's not just going to send back a check mark that you successfully elected, but it's actually going to send another message out to the database that says, so-and-so has liked this picture on Instagram. Questions? Okay, so what's an API look like? Oh, there was a question. Whoops, let me find me. Oh, the answer to the question about questions was no questions. Great. Okay. Okay, so what's an API look like? So here is an example of the New York Times API that we will look at later. Okay, so this is a web interface to the API, which is getting a bit meta because the API itself is invisible. You can't see it. It's just code that responds to requests. But most APIs are presented this way, where they'll say, okay, the API here is called article search. Okay, the place that it can be found is at developer.newyorktimes.com/article_search_v2.json. JSON is basically saying, and by the way, when I get the results back, send them to me in JSON. Over on the left, what you'll see is some specifications of when you make this request, here are the things that you can put a question mark. So here are the parameters that you can specify. So for example, if you look for articles, you're allowed to say, starting with this date. So begin_date equals, and you have to have a value. And what they're here saying, here's the format for the date parameter that you're going to send. And look at this. Isn't it a good thing that we learned about regex last week, right? Because it's saying it's going to be something where the start of a word has to be a digit, and then how many of them? There's 8, and then the end of a word, okay? And then they're telling us, oh, by the way, they're in the form of YYYY MDD, right? So it's year, month, date, year, month, day. Okay, the end date is in the same format. So I tell you what are all the different parameters, and then what are the values for that. Saying, talk to me, right? Use this language, and then I'll know what you want, and so on. Over here, they're going to give you an opportunity to try these out. So I could type in something here, and I could begin date. So I'm going to see if it. I have this linked, so let's see if it'll jump me to it, but it won't. So I will jump out of here. Okay. Are you still able to see this screen? Okay, so just try a little switcheroo here. Okay, so can you see the Times API now? Okay. So I'm going to jump into authorize it. And So I go down here, and in the query, I'm going to see what happens if I put in Dan Ryan. And so this down here is JSON that comes back from this. And you can tell that there are just lots and lots of Dans in the world. So this is an article from 2012. And you look at this JSON, and it's kind of ugly, right? It just is like, oh my God, look at that stuff. And we'll see in a little while that the beauty of JSON is, although it may look ugly right now, it turns out not all that ridiculous. Anyway, so that just gives a sense of how you can play with that interface. Okay, now I'm going to back to, okay, are we back? So here's another example of API. This is an API for a service called Leaflet, which is a JavaScript library that lets you write web pages that are geo-active. In other words, they have maps on them, and the map will use the geolocation information on your phone, and so you can very quickly mock up an app that has that knows where you are and can do things if you're within a certain distance of other objects, and you can put layers on there so you can build a map of campus and show where all the good food stands are and so on and so forth. Here's the SoundCloud API with some example code here. So you could create an API that lets you upload stuff to SoundCloud or find music on SoundCloud. This is the Pokemon API. You can access the API and then write code, create web pages that will take a look at that. Here's the Zotero API. Zotero is a bibliography manager, and it's the one that I use to produce the links of readings in this course. So how does that work? So we have a URL like this thing in the middle. We send that up to the Zotero API, and then the Zotero API sends back some JSON, and then we display that as HTML. So I click on this, or if you have this as your if you're looking at this slide deck, have I just gone into a new window so I've lost you? I think so. Anyway, so I'll let you do that if you have a copy of it. But anyway, if you click on this, this will grab these things and send you a formatted bibliography. Okay. So I'm going to now to our. Okay, can we see the quiz now? So so we start out. So this is an example right here. This list of readings is being produced by a call to the Zotero API right in the middle of our quiz. So our learning outcomes here, we're trying to figure out what APIs are, recognize the acronyms for different kinds, a sense of where you can find API documentation and how you can start to learn how to do it, how to use URL parameters. And then the last two things we're going to do next. What's an asynchronous function? And how do we handle the JavaScript objects, the JSON objects that are coming back to us? So we're going to zoom ahead past these things. So this is the material that we went over. Okay, so the lab at the end of this, and this lab will basically be the problem set. So we need to just walk through this. So we're basically going to set up a simple web page in brackets, and eventually we're going to take some code that we develop in CodePen and move it over here so that you have a very simple app that will access the New York Times API and do something to the output. So, and we'll get to it at the end of this, what we mean by do something. So the basic program is going to look like this. It just have a title, New York Times, and mine, I'm calling mine about rainbows. On the style section up here in the header, we'll have some style code, some CSS code from the CodePen. And then there's this one script line here, which is accessing a JavaScript library called P5. One of the videos that kind of introduces this exercise is by a guy who calls himself or calls his service CodeTrain. And his example, which we're following, he accesses this library called P5. P5 is a graphics library for JavaScript. It's essentially an implementation of a thing called processing, which is a very cool graphics library, a graphics programming language that looks a lot like Java in its raw form, but there's now a JavaScript version of it, and P5 is related to that. All we really need to know is that we're including this line, and that you can include a script source equals and then URL, and then you close it with the script tag at the end. And what that does is it says, whenever this web page loads, we're going to go and grab whatever JavaScript is at that address, and we're going to include that in our file here, even though we won't look at it. And then in our code, stuff that we write, we are allowed to access and make use of some of the resources that are in that file. And so the one that we're going to use is this function called load.json, which takes a lot of the dirty work out of making an API call. So the code that we're going to develop in the CodePen goes right here. And then down here, we'll go a little bit of HTML for the display of that stuff. So this is the mini lecture we're going to watch to introduce the exercise. So it's about 15 minutes long. This guy is a little manic, but he's actually great. He's a great teacher. It's a long series of things. So some of what he talks about, you can see this is item 10.9 in his series. Every now and then he'll say things that refer to earlier things in the series. If you want to really polish up your JavaScript chops, by all means go back and look those over, but you don't need to. Everything that we're going to need for our purposes is in this video and the material in the quiz. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is just set up a very simple CodePen that has just a tiny little bit of CSS, and the JavaScript in it is just a function that says hello, and all that thing does is go to our HTML document, finds an element that has the name Sentinel, and then puts the inner HTML of that thing to the word hello. And if I go back over here, this element paragraph is called Sentinel. It's had ID. And notice there's nothing in here. It has no, it's inner HTML, the stuff between the two tags, there's nothing there. And so all we have right now over here is the words greet me, right? And title. So here's the title, here's the button, but there's nothing down here where that paragraph is, it's empty. But when I click it, right, now I get something, the word hello, in between here. So that's what happened there. So the idea here is that we're just starting out with a totally zero order refinement, and we've got ourselves something that works. Okay. So in order to do the assignment, you have to get authorized to use the API. And the authorization is going to come about. You're going to go to the developer site at the New York Times, and you're going to apply for what we call an API key. Okay, so this is going to be your secret identifier. And anytime you make a request to the API, one of the parameters in the URL is going to be API key equals, and then a string of hexadecimal numbers, digits, that is your API key. Okay, and it's not like your Bitcoin wallet address, but you do want to keep it to yourself, and have one that's your own, and so on. And so you'll notice that although I show one on the screen here, and you can dig into the code and stuff here, and you could find my API key, but I try to disguise it a little bit so that you're not doing it directly. Then what we do is we sort of walk through a little bit of the logic of how this thing works. Okay, so I'm giving you a little dramatic reading here of a scenario between two partners. Okay, so partner A says, "Hey, what do we need from the store, honey?" And what we want to think of that is that's sending a request to the API, right? And what partner A then does is just kind of sit tight, right? And doesn't do anything. Doesn't start going to the store, right? Because honey hasn't answered yet, right? And so partner A is making the request and then goes into a wait state. Okay? There's actually a language that's used in JavaScript called promises, right? And so when a piece of code makes a promise, it says, "Look, I'll get back to you about that," and you kind of sit tight. And then we say when the promise is fulfilled, then a certain action takes place. So this is going to be called using a callback function. Okay, so partner A says, "Hey, what do we need from the store, honey?" And then sits there and just waits. And then gets a text back. Hopefully his partner or her partner is not sending JSON, but we're putting it on here just to be a little funny. So we get back an array of food, milk, butter, and eggs, and supplies. We need some firewood, some motor oil, and a wheelbarrow. And partner A goes to the grocery store, buys the milk, butter, and eggs, and then goes to the hardware store, gets the firewood, the motor oil, and the wheelbarrow. So the act of going to the store is the callback function here. The act of saying, what do we need from the store? That's the API request. So you can think of it that the API request has two components. One is, who are you making the request to? And the answer in this case is honey. And then the second part is, what are you going to do when the information comes back? That's the callback function. So in this case, it's go to the store. So if we were writing this in pseudocode, it would look like this. You get your user input, you create a API URL, and then you make the API call with those URL with the parameters that you just created, and then the name of the callback function. And so the name of the callback function here, right, I'm just spelling it out, name of callback function. That's going to be another function that I write in the Java code. And it has a parameter called data. That is the JSON that comes back. So the callback function, when I name it up top, when I name it up here, right, I don't put anything after it, which is kind of unusual because you're used to seeing functions have parentheses after them. But here I just give you the name of it. And later on the code, I actually define that, and I define it as a function that takes one input parameter called data. And then the code inside of here is going to always be stuff that's operating on this object data. This is the JSON object that I got back from the server. So let's look at what that looks like down here. Here's the JavaScript part. So I just write out the URL, right? So URL equals blah, 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 API.New York Times, SVC, search, article search.json, question mark. And then what do I want? I want a query for rainbows. I want articles about rainbows. And then here's where I put my API key in. But you're going to put your own API key in here, not mine. Right? This first part is generic stuff that is the way P5 works. So P5 always runs a setup function. No canvas means I know P5 is for drawing artwork, but we're not drawing anything. And then I just use this function, this method here called load JSON. I give it this URL up here that I just defined, and I give it the name of my callback function, data. And then down here, I'm defining my callback function, and that callback function is got data parenthesis data. Okay, that's cool. We'll have the rest of the recording, and I'll finish. This will just go for another 4 or 5 minutes. So. Let me get back to the screen I was on. Okay, here. So the processing of this thing called data, right, is right down here. And what is that thing? Okay, it's a big data structure, and it has a component called response, which has a component called docs, which is an array. And that array has elements in it that are objects, and one of the components of that is a headline, and one of the components of that is main. Now we'll see later on how to suss out what that structure looks like. So right now we just take it as given. So here's the HTML, and then let's look at what the result looks like. So Randy's Rainbows Upper West Side story. So that is the output of the one of the things we just got back from that. So the rest of the tutorial walks you through different pieces of building this. So first we figure out how do we build that API request. And then we take a look at what comes back. And I introduce you here to a thing called a JSON viewer and editor. And so what you can do is you can take this JSON here, and it's enormous, so I'm just going to use Control A. I'm going to copy it, and then I go down here, and I can stick it in and tell it to translate it. And so now, in this window, I have a nicely formatted version of the thing that I got back from the New York Times. And then here's another JSON viewer that lets you do it here. After you've come to understand what it looks like, you can figure out how big and what the things are. And so we're going to see that it's got 3 components, a word status, a copyright, and then this thing called response. And response has 2 components. It's got a component called docs and a component called meta. And the component called docs is an array, square brackets, and the object called meta, the component called meta, is an object with 3 components. And so now take a look and say, can we read this? Can we figure it out? And then we're going to build a little bit of extra code in here. We're going to loop over so we can see all the components, all the headlines. And then we just take you through a number of these things. And then the very end of this process, what we ask you to do at the very end is to come up with a slight variation on what we've got so far. So you need to look at the JSON, and you might say, I'm going to grab one of the pictures associated with these things. I'm going to grab another paragraph of text. I'm going to make a link to it. I'm going to change the format and so on. And you want to then be able to port this over to the brackets editor and save it as an HTML file, and then see if you can get it to run over there. So that'll be the end of the, that's the end of the tutorial to do that. Questions? Okay, so that's it. Questions are welcome tomorrow in our session then, if you want to try this. But we'll pick up with the next topic tomorrow, which should be so this was APIs in everyday life, and so first thing we'll do tomorrow is more exploration of that API and that tutorial. So if you try it before then, and then we can troubleshoot, and then we'll from 11 to 12 we'll do a review of previous material from earlier modules, and then Thursday we'll do computer vision, the lecture, and then Friday the lab.